dear colleagues from Paris, and many thanks for joining us today. My name is Araceli Fernandez. I coordinate the work on energy demand technologies at the Energy Policy Division of the IEA, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you today for the launch of the IEA's annual Global Electric Vehicle Outlook. Let me start with a few words of background. The Global EV Outlook is the flagship publication of the IEA Electric Vehicle Initiative. EVI is an initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial that has been dedicated to accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles around the world. And it was established at the Clean Energy Ministerial about 10 years ago in 2010. And since then, the IEA has been acting as the coordinator of this platform. This initiative is a multi-government policy forum dedicated to support the design and the implementation of domestic electric vehicle deployment policies and programs. And within the initiative, the IEA facilitates exchanges between governments and with a variety of partners, including from the industry. We've carried out from the IEA many activities under the EVI over the past decade, including not only exchanges with different partners, but also stimulating and mobilizing action and commitments. For example, through the EV30 at 30 campaign that was launched in 2017, but also through the Drive to Zero campaign that was launched last year. And a very important output of our Global EV Outlook is that we've been publishing it since 2013, which is the main subject of today's webinar. And so you may ask the question, why the IEA put so much effort into electric mobility in general? And there's a very clear answer to this. First of all, electric vehicles can help address local air pollution. They can reduce as well all import bills from many governments, but very importantly, they are key in addressing climate change. As you all know, reaching net zero emissions goals that are being brought forward by many governments around the world will require not only decarbonizing the power sector, but it will require to deploy a broad suite of clean energy technologies across the whole energy sector. This would include areas such as heavy industries, buildings, and of course, all the different transport modes, from shipping, aviation, into, of course, road transport, including cars, trucks, buses, two-wheelers, and so on. So as my colleague, Dr. Jacopo Tattini, will tell you in a few minutes, electric vehicles have shown some remarkable successes lately. Electric car sales grew from literally nothing some 10 years ago to catch around 3% of the global car markets in 2019. And even though car markets collapsed last year as the pandemic broke out, electric car sales keep rising to reach more than 3 million by the end of 2020. And now that the first quarter of 2021 has passed and we've observed the market dynamics, we can really see that that trend hasn't really slowed down. So these are really remarkable successes. And Dr. Tattini will explain to you in a few minutes what have been the various reasons behind these dynamics. But there is one main reason that I wanted to highlight to you in the introduction, which is that government policy has been really key in stimulating this growth. Already before the pandemic, many governments have put supporting policy frameworks in place to bring down emissions from passenger cars and to bring electric cars into the market. In the wake of the pandemic, several governments increased their support even further, increasing subsidies and supporting the rollout of recharging infrastructure. For electric cars to make the required contributions to our energy and climate goals, we will need, however, further efforts. And we will need tangible and concrete policies that will help longer-term visions for the energy sector as a whole to be translated into concrete and measurable action into transport. My colleague, Dr. Tattini, will show you that current policy efforts that have been put in place already today will help electric cars to make major inroads into car markets over the next decade. However, he will also show that on the basis of current trends, we are not there yet to the level of the efforts that will be required to reach our ambitious climate goals. So from the IEA, we will certainly continue to monitor progress on electric vehicles, and not only of cars, but also across the different transport modes and across different areas of the energy system. On the 18th of May, we'll be setting out and releasing a roadmap for the whole energy sector to reach net zero emissions by 2050. We will explore the role of electric vehicles in meeting that goal, as well as many other strategies and technologies across the whole energy system. And we will continue not only to analyze and monitor actively what electric vehicles progress is being, but also we would like really to support actively working with governments through the electric vehicle initiative, how these policies can be designed and implemented to make sure that we can accelerate progress. So with this, I just wanted to thank all the contributors that have been really numerous, that contributed and helped to the development of the project across different countries, across different institutions, and many different stakeholders, as well as all the IEA authors that contributed to the report, starting with the lead author, Jacopo Taccini, but also big thanks to Jacob Tita, Leonardo Paoli, Elizabeth Connelly, Ekta Vibra, Christopher Lowens, Marine Garner, and some of which will be presenting today, and some of which couldn't make it to the event, but big thanks come to all of them. And with that, I just wanted to pass the floor to my colleague, Jacopo Taccini, which will start with the presentation in more detail. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the introduction, Araceli. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having made time in your busy days to join us today for the second launch webinar of the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook 2021. I'm saying second web launch because yesterday we have already hosted the launch in the American continent. We have a lot of exciting developments on electric mobility to share with you today. And over the next 30 minutes, my colleagues and I are going to show you and to explain you some of the recent developments in this space. So the format of the webinar will be the following. For the next 30-35 minutes, my colleagues are going to show the key findings from this year's edition of the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook. And afterwards, we will have some time to answer to your questions. So please, I invite everyone to use the question and answer button that you should be able to see on the bottom of the presentation. And at the end, we will take your questions. Now, without further delaying, I will pass the word to my IEA colleagues, Christopher Lowens, Leonardo Paoli, and Jacob Titer. We will share some of the key recent developments in the electric mobility space. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jacopo. And next slide, please. So as we can see, EVs experienced a period of very fast growth up to 2019. There were fears that the pandemic would interrupt this progress, but despite the pandemic, the electric car market has performed very strongly in 2020. At the end of 2020, there were 10.2 million electric cars on the road worldwide, with battery electric vehicles accounting for around 2/3 of this total. Almost half of the global stock of electric cars is located in China. However, Europe experienced the largest increase during 2020, attaining a stock of 3.2 million vehicles. Next slide, please. Global electric car sales reached around 3 million in 2020, hitting a sales share of 4.6%. Or in other words, almost 1 in every 20 cars sold in 2020 was electric. It's important to highlight that the surge in electric car sales happened in the context of an overall car market severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, car sales globally dropped by 16%. The largest increase of sales happened in Europe, where there were nearly 1.4 million electric sales, thus overtaking China for the first time and marking a 10% sales share. The largest European markets were Germany, France, and the UK, with Germany seeing sales of almost 400,000. In terms of sales share, the largest markets were Norway, Iceland, and Sweden, with Norway reaching 75% sales share. Behind Europe, China followed with 1.2 million electric sales, and subsequently the US with almost 300,000. However, in other regions, we can see that EV sales have stalled. Next slide, please. While most EV charging is done at home and at work, the rollout of publicly accessible charging will be critical as countries leading in EV deployment will face increasing demands from EV owners. The number of publicly accessible chargers reached 1.3 million in 2020, 30% of which are fast chargers. The stock of publicly accessible chargers was up by 45%, slower than the 85% growth seen in the preceding year, likely because work was interrupted in key markets due to the pandemic. China has the largest stock of both slow and fast publicly accessible chargers, with over 800,000 in total, where deployment is driven by a relatively lower number of private chargers compared to other regions, coupled with goals for rapid EV deployment. In terms of cars per charger, the global car to public charger ratio is 8.1, with China at 5.9, Europe at 11.6, and the United States at 18.0. Next slide, please. For the first time, with this edition of the Global EV Outlook, we have also released a web platform that enables users to explore and download EV statistics and projections. This is called the Global EV Data Explorer, and you can find it on the IEA website. Historical data enable you to choose between sales, stock, sales shares, and stock shares, electricity demand, and other items, and choose between regions and transport modes. You can additionally view our projections, which are also disaggregated by mode and by region. Next, I will hand over to my colleague Leonardo Pauli, who will discuss other trends and developments in EV markets.
Thank you very much, Christopher. So as we've seen in the previous slides, 2020 has been a remarkable year for the electric vehicle market. Now we're going to dig beneath the surface of the numbers presented so far, and we're going to start by looking at the quantification of the financial market associated with electric cars. According to our estimates, in 2020, consumers have spent 120 billion on the purchase of electric vehicles, electric cars. This is a 50% increase compared to the previous year. And this increase can be explained mostly by the increase in sales, but also by an increase in the average price of electric vehicles sold in 2020 compared to 2019. It is not just consumers that spend money on electric vehicles, but it is also governments. Governments do so by means of direct subsidies for the purchase of electric cars and by other fiscal incentives. According to our estimates, in 2020, 14 billion were spent by governments across the world for the purchase of electric vehicles. In terms of regional differences, there's been a decrease in spending from China and the United States, but this has been compensated by a large increase in spending from Europe, where not only sales have surged, but also the incentives in many key markets have increased. And all in all, this has meant that spending by governments has increased by 25% compared to the previous year. Now, if we look at the share of government spending in the overall expenditure on electric cars, we see that there's been a constant decreasing trend in this share. 2020 has confirmed this long-term trend, and it is now places the share at roughly 10%. Therefore, for every $10 spent in the electric vehicles market, governments roughly contributed for $1. Now, it is not just the volume of the electric vehicle market that has increased in 2020, it is also its variety and availability of models. In fact, according to our estimates, in 2020, consumers could choose from over 350 different models of cars with electric powertrains. This is a 40% increase over 2019. And we can also see that battery electric vehicles form the majority of the models available with an electric powertrain. In terms of range, electric range, the distance that could be covered by electric cars has been increasing since 2015. And in 2020, on the other hand, there's been a plateauing of this trend, with the range sort of being constant at roughly 350 kilometers. Instead, when we look at plug-in hybrids, the long-term trend of having roughly 50 kilometers of range has been confirmed in 2020. Now, if we overlay the geographical distribution over model availability, The first thing to say is that there are significant differences across the three major markets. In China, there are roughly 200 different electric models available. In the European Union, there are roughly 100, whereas in the United States, there are about half this amount. In terms of availability across different automotive segments, the first thing that meets the eye is the high number of SUVs in all the markets. In fact, over 50% of available electric cars are SUVs. However, to put this into perspective, this share of model availability is not too dissimilar to the share of SUVs in the overall car market. At least that is the case for China and the United States. Now, in terms of powertrains, plug-in hybrids tend to still be relegated to the larger types of vehicles. In fact, there is no small car with a plug-in hybrid powertrain. On the other hand, battery electric vehicles are available across the spectrum of segments. It is therefore safe to say that this surge in EVs in 2020 was also partially due to the increased availability and variety of electric vehicle models that were offered by OEMs to consumers. So if we go to the next slide, until now, we've been discussing about electric cars. However, electric cars are not the only mode that is electrifying in road transport. In fact, 2- and 3-wheelers is the mode that has observed the highest number of electric vehicle sales, standing at about 25 million in 2020. And this is roughly 1 order of magnitude higher than electric cars. It is not just 2- and 3-wheelers, it is also the larger commercial vehicles that are electrifying, and progress is being made here as well. However, the numbers for these transport modes are much smaller. If we now overlay the geographical distribution over these sales, it is clear that 2- and 3-wheelers are mostly concentrated in the Chinese market. And this is also the case for buses and heavy trucks, although at a relatively lower extent. On the other hand, when we look at vans, we see that this mode is more evenly distributed across geographies and has a distribution that is similar to the one observed for passenger cars. I will now give the floor to Jacob Teeter, that will discuss more in detail the electrification of these heavier vehicles.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Pauli. This chart shows the number of commercial vehicle models available in regions across the world and by vehicle type. The data are taken from CalStart's corporate Drive to Zero campaign, which is an initiative under the Clean Energy Ministerial. And these data come from CalStart's accompanying interactive web tool, ZETI, the Zero Emission Technology Inventory, and you can find this online. And the vehicle categories shown here are mapped to IEA's segments for modeling of medium and heavy duty vehicles. So transit applications account for most vehicle models here. And that's partially because Chinese OEMs like BYD and Yudong already account for the lion's share of urban bus sales, all electric in China. The number of models being announced to enter the commercial vehicle market over the coming 2-3 years in medium and heavy truck applications, things like municipal service and urban delivery vans, but also in the medium freight truck segment, things like box trucks, step vans, and refrigerated trucks, is consistent with historical trends. But we actually expect the model offer in these segments to grow quite rapidly as battery technologies are at a point where they can start to enable cost-competitive operations in many use cases. Also, it's worth noting that the number of models doesn't necessarily give the full picture on market readiness. Take, for example, Tesla's 4 models in the light-duty segment, which in some markets capture a big and growing share of the market. Or Amazon, for instance, with their order of 100,000 Rivians. All of these are a single model, but big corporate buyers like Amazon or other logistics companies can translate into very high sales volumes. Next slide, please. This chart also extracts information from CalStart's ZETI tool. And along the x-axis, you see the announced vehicle range by manufacturer for each model. And on the y-axis, the announcement date for medium and heavy freight trucks and buses. The dotted black lines indicate the simple average range across all models for each segment. One note about the ZE tool: for China's market, most major OEMs are covered, but given the relative lack of consolidation among Chinese manufacturers, models from some smaller OEMs aren't yet included. But CalSTART continues to work to input data into the ZE tool. Also worth noting that these are officially announced models, so some announcements that are expected but haven't yet come down the pipeline to official announcements aren't shown. That said, CalSTART is ready to put them into the tool once the official announcement is made. So the average range for all three of these vehicle categories is already nearly 300 kilometers across all of the segments. And this can provide sufficient range for lots of daily operations with overnight fast charging at less than 100 kilowatts. The average range is expected to grow. And as you can see in the middle right, in the heavy duty segment, there are both battery electric and fuel cell electric models that are expected to exceed 1,000 kilometers range. And there's lots of room for growth in these heavier duty segments. Thanks, and next slide, and now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Connolly.
Thanks, Jacob. Great, so now we'll take a look at the policies that have helped support this growth in electric vehicles. I'll start by reviewing some of the policies related to light-duty vehicles, and here I'll focus on 5 major markets, but I wanted to mention that we've also launched the Global EV Policy Explorer to accompany this year's report, and so you can check out that tool on our website, as well as the report itself for more comprehensive policy coverage. These 5 markets shown, China, the EU, India, Japan, and the United States, together constituted over 75% of car sales in 2020, total car sales, not just electric. And common to all of these markets is fuel economy or CO2 emission standards for light-duty vehicles. In general, the gradual tightening of fuel economy standards has encouraged automakers to increase sales of electric vehicles as a means of compliance. China is entering its 5th phase of fuel economy standards this July, and last year the EU phased in its new emission standards. India began implementing fuel efficiency standards in 2017, with the 2nd phase set to begin in 2022. Japan has also had light-duty vehicle emission standards for decades, and last year issued their target for 2030. And what's unique about this is that they've expanded the scope to cover electric vehicles, taking into account upstream energy efficiency. Last year, the US enacted a revised fuel economy standard, basically weakening the required annual improvement in fuel economy for model years 2021 through 2026. However, the new administration has indicated that they plan to review these standards and potentially reenact more stringent fuel economy standards. In addition to fuel economy standards, zero emission vehicle mandates and electrification targets are also used to support EV adoption. China recently extended their ZEV credit mandate to 2023 with a target of 18%. And by 2025, China is targeting 20% of car sales to be zero emission vehicles. At the end of 2020, the EU released a Sustainable Mobility Action Plan with the milestone of 30 million zero-emission cars on the road by 2030. These types of electrification targets, as well as ICE bans, are also being applied at the city level, as you can see in India, and at the state level in the United States, and among member states of the European Union. Finally, another important mechanism is fiscal incentives, which can take the form of purchase subsidies and tax credits, for example. Looking at India, the main EV policy is the Faster Adoption and Manufacturing of Electric Vehicles, or FAME2 policy, which has allocated the equivalent of $1.4 billion over 3 years from 2019 to 2022 to subsidize 1.6 million hybrid and electric vehicles. And this is actually broader than just cars and includes 2- and 3-wheelers and buses as well. In 2020, in response to the COVID pandemic, we also saw some countries bumping up their EV incentives and extending programs that were previously set to be phased out. But taking a step back, we also see that there's really 3 main drivers of EV growth during the pandemic. And as Leo already mentioned, we think the first of those is industry expanding the number of EV models available. The second is the pre-existing supportive policy framework, which we discussed, the fuel economy standards and kind of pre-pandemic financial incentives. And thirdly are additional incentives the countries have provided to shield EV sales and from the economic impacts of the pandemic. Notably, Germany, France, and Italy have increased EV purchase incentives last year, and we think this helped contribute to the 55% increase in electric car sales in Europe during the first half of 2020 compared to that time period in 2019. You'll notice here that we're also showing that China has actually decreased slightly their subsidies last year, but these subsidies were originally intended to be phased out completely in 2020, and in the face of the pandemic, China decided to delay this phasing out and only reduce slightly. So now I'll turn it back over to Jacob to review some of the policies supporting electric heavy-duty vehicles.
Thanks, Elizabeth. First, let me say that some good questions are starting to come, but please keep those good questions coming. So similar to Elizabeth, I'll run through the high-level and noteworthy national and regional policy impacts specific to zero-emission vehicles, and these are for buses, trucks, and other commercial vehicles. Starting with China, strong provincial and central government support has helped drive adoption of light-duty vehicles and transit buses, but this support is now also seeing success in ushering medium and heavy-duty models into the market. So for instance, in 2016, when the central government subsidies were reduced, you saw a reduction in the sales of medium freight trucks. And these were set to phase out in 2020, but in fact, they were extended in 2020 to 2022, and they may be further revised. These subsidies are awarded directly to manufacturers, making vehicles less expensive to purchase. The subsidies are tied to the battery capacity of the vehicles, so the bigger the battery, the bigger the subsidy, with modifiers and caps set by bus length and truck weight. This will help to drive production of vehicles capable of greater ranges and higher gross vehicle weight operations. On top of these central government subsidies, many local governments may and often do add substantial additional financial incentives to local industry champions. Fuel economy standards in China, while they don't explicitly promote EVs, have supported efficiency improvements, including the development of electrified components also here in the medium and heavy duty segments. Moving on now to Europe. Europe also has CO2 emission standards. And here, the initial goal is to reduce specific CO2 emissions by 15% in 2025 and 30% by 2030. Noteworthy in the European standards is the inclusion of ZEV targets or support. The standards provide super credits that double the credit value of a zero emission vehicle through 2024. And then in 2025, these will be replaced with a separate benchmarking system. Another unique policy element is the Clean Vehicles Directive, which establishes member nation targets for alternative fuel vehicles, including zero emission vehicles. This directive allows flexibility to the member states on how to best meet assigned targets, giving them autonomy to devise effective strategies to deploy clean vehicles. And then the EU is made up of member states with their own ambitions. So purchase incentives are available in member states, notably Germany, Spain, Italy, France, ranging from 9,000 to up to 50,000 euros. The Netherlands has a unique program as well to put in place zero emission zones in up to 40 of its largest cities by 2025. The US has also created an exemption for cargo capacity of up to 2 tons, something similar, the EU has created an exemption for cargo capacity up to 2 tons. Something similar is also put in place by California, by the way. And this is because batteries are heavier than an ICE engine and reduce cargo capacity, and this necessarily reduces also the efficiency of the electric trucks. Moving on to India, the FAME 2 program supports broad EV development for 2 3-wheelers, light-duty vehicles, and heavy-duty vehicles. In the heavier applications, India is focusing on reaching the target of transit buses, 7,000 transit buses, and putting in place the requisite infrastructure to support these buses. At a local level, Delhi's target to get to 25% of sales being electric vehicles by 2024 applies to 2-wheelers, shared public transport vehicles, and other commercial vehicles. Japan's national government basic hydrogen strategy targets 1,200 fuel cell urban buses by 2030 as part of a broader national effort to create a hydrogen economy. Japan's phase 2 heavy duty standards will improve vehicle efficiency, but they don't target zero emission vehicles, and they mandate relatively modest efficiency improvements of about 14%, which furthermore don't come into effect until 2025. And then lastly, the United States. The federal level phase 2 medium and heavy duty vehicle standards do include credit multipliers for plug-in hybrids of 3.5, battery electrics of 4.5, and fuel cell electric vehicles of 5.5 to stimulate sales of these vehicles. But in general, given the consistent lack of federal government support for commercialization of ZEVs, states have stepped in to the policy vacuum and are pushing ambitious goals. 15 states are coordinating to accelerate medium and heavy duty vehicle ZEV adoption through a memorandum of understanding. And the goal here is to achieve 100% zero emission vehicle sales by 2050 with an interim goal of 30% by 2030. This is again for the medium and heavy duty segment. These states are mostly on the West Coast and in the Northeast and account for a large portion of the US market. And finally, California, which through the waiver carved out for it in the Clean Air Act, has unique jurisdiction to create new rules, has been aggressive in creating new opportunities through incentives and regulations. California's advanced clean truck rule builds on its world-leading transport and energy policy experience and the light-duty vehicle ZEV mandates, and it requires manufacturers to sell zero-emission vehicles as a percentage of total vehicle sales, increasing up to 40 to 75% depending on the segment by 2035. This ZEV rule was also adopted by New Jersey, and a lot of other states are looking into implementing or adapting it as well. California has also put in place a voucher incentive program that uses an innovative point of purchase design to reduce the incremental cost of qualified clean commercial vehicle technologies, and this includes zero emission vehicles, which have earned over $120 million in vouchers already. This program has been replicated in New York, and similar programs are launching in New Jersey and Massachusetts. California's low carbon fuel standard is both a regulation that reduces the carbon content of fuels and an incentive that rewards producers and end users of low carbon fuels such as electricity. And that has been adopted by British Columbia, Oregon, and just recently Washington. Last but not least, California's innovative clean transit rule requires public transit agencies to purchase only zero emission buses by 2029 and to achieve fully zero emission fleets by 2040. So we've seen a lot of policy support for electrification on both the light and heavy duty side. And now I'll turn it over back to Dr. Connolly to tell us more about how these policies fit into national ambitions and target setting for electrified vehicles and for reducing greenhouse gas emissions economy-wide.
Great, thanks. So as countries are laying out their climate goals, we see more and more electrification targets and ICE phase-outs from as early as 2025. Here we're showing over 20 countries with light-duty vehicle electrification targets. These targets vary country by country. Some are targeting 100% electrified sales, as indicated in the lighter shade of yellow, and these include hybrid electric vehicles. For example, you can see that the UK's strategy is to target 100% electrified sales in 2030, but then in 2035, this target becomes 100% zero emission car sales, which excludes hybrids, and here is focused really on battery electric and fuel cell electric vehicles. A number of the countries that have set electrification ambitions have also set economy-wide net zero emission pledges, which will entail broader electrification of transport beyond just light-duty vehicles. We show here 8 countries and the European Union which have proposed or already enacted legislation supporting these pledges. I should also mention, though, there's over 100 other countries who have announced net zero pledges, but maybe just in policy documents and haven't yet put it into legislation. And so examples of this are China and Japan, which you don't see on this figure. So with this, now that we've gone over an overview of the policy landscape, I'll hand it over to Dr. Tatini to discuss how we see these policies and commitments impacting future EV adoption.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Dr. Connolly. So looking to the future, the outlook for electric vehicles is bright. If we take into consideration the existing and announced policies, the electric vehicle stock across all transport modes, excluding 2- and 3-wheelers, is expected to grow from 11 million today to 145 million by 2030. What it means is that by 2030, 1 every 14 vehicles that we will see on the streets will be an electric vehicle. However, the potential opportunity space here is even larger, because to reach the objectives of the Paris Agreement and the climate goals, the global electric vehicle fleet will need to reach 230 million electric vehicles by 2030. And the demand for automotive batteries is set to increase strongly over the next decade, following the strong electric vehicle growth that I've just described. In 2020, the annual demand for automotive lithium-ion batteries was 160 gigawatt-hour. But in the stated policy scenario, in 2030, it is set to become 1.6 terawatt-hour, so 10 times larger than the annual demand today. And this could become even 20 times larger, equal to 3.2 terawatt-hours under the Sustainable Development Scenario. And it's interesting to note that if we take into account the announcements from the private sector on the battery production capacity, this is equal to around 3.2 terawatt-hour, which is the amount that is shown here, the demand that we expect that might be reached under the Sustainable Development Scenario. Meaning that if we take into consideration the private commitment, we can fulfill the demand of the Sustainable Development Scenario. And looking into the demand of batteries from the regional point of view, we can see that China is expected to be the main market until the end of this decade. Well, if we look at it from another point of view, from the point of view of the different transport modes, we see that light-duty vehicles are the mode, so light-duty vehicles is cars and vans. This is the mode that is expected to drive the demand of automotive batteries over this decade. And it will account for approximately 85% of the total in both the stated policy scenario and Sustainable Development Scenario. Electric vehicles already today are an important contributor to mitigate climate change. In 2020, the global electric vehicle fleet emitted approximately 50 million tons of CO2 emission equivalent. But that same fleet, if it was composed by conventional vehicles, would have emitted twice as much, which basically result in a total net avoided emission of approximately 50 megatons of CO2. And if we take into account the existing and announced policies, the global EV fleet is set to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by more than 1/3 compared to the case in which the fleet was composed by internal combustion engine vehicles. And it basically implies a net saving of 120 megatons of CO2. If we consider a faster decarbonization of the power grid, of the electricity generation, and also a faster expansion of the electric vehicle fleet in line with the Paris Agreement, then the total greenhouse gas emissions that could be displaced would be approximately 410 megatons of CO2 equivalent. This basically highlights that to fully unleash the climate change mitigation potential of electric vehicles, it's very important, it's crucial to decarbonize electricity generation. Coming to the conclusions, the global electric vehicle market over 2020 has proved to be resilient to the pandemic. This was achieved thanks to the pre-existing policies that many governments around the world have put in place, but also thanks to the additional incentives that numerous countries have established over the course of the years to shield electric cars and electric vehicle sales more broadly from the pandemic, as Dr. Connolly explained before, notably France, Germany, Italy, but also China that postponed the phase out of the incentives. And early signs in 2021 show that the growth of electric cars that was experienced last year is also continuing in the first quarter of 2021, with sales of electric cars in the first quarter of 2021 being 140% higher than what was registered last year over the same period. The pandemic is also offering an opportunity to build back better. And through the recovery funds, the governments have the opportunity to promote electric mobility. And here electric mobility, we refer to electric mobility more broadly, not just electric vehicle sales, but also the deployment of the publicly accessible charging infrastructure and the creation of factories and companies that will produce and recycle sustainable batteries. It is very likely that over the course of the next decade, the growth of electric vehicles will continue, then we will continue seeing more and more electric cars on the roads and electric vehicles. But this is not enough. We must strengthen policies in order to really enable the electric vehicle fleet to contribute to the climate change mitigation. And particularly, we need to achieve this through three types of measures. First of all, tightening the fuel economy and CO2 emission standards, and also enacting zero-emission vehicle mandates in all the countries that today don't have yet these schemes in place. Second, targeting the support to the publicly accessible charging infrastructure, and developing also standards for the environmentally and environmentally and socially responsible battery manufacturing. And last but not least, we should also have policies that are aiming at accelerating the decarbonization of the power generation, which will enable to fully reap the environmental benefits of electric vehicles. Thank you very much. That's all for today's webinar. And now we are happy to take your questions. So I invite everyone, for those of you who have not yet submitted questions, to please use the question and answer box. And Jacob, my colleague Dr. Jacob Tieder will moderate this session. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jacopo. We have a lot of great questions coming in from many colleagues who we know quite well. So I'll just dive into the questions. Actually, I'll start with one from Eamon Mulholland, who worked with us a couple of years ago on heavy-duty vehicles and now is working on heavy-duty vehicles again in Europe. He asks the question on China's uptake in heavy-duty vehicles. They're leading the global market, but seem to have a low level of model availability. So the question is, what's driving the surge? And as I mentioned in my presentation on that piece, first, government subsidies for manufacturers. The Chinese government has drawn a lot of policy learnings from its policy mechanisms to incentivize ZEVs in light-duty vehicles. They've learned about what's worked and what has not worked so well, and they're extending that now, given improvements in battery technologies, now making heavier and heavier duty vehicles more technologically and economically feasible. They're extending that to these vehicle segments. One thing to mention is, CalSTART doesn't have full visibility on all of the models in the Chinese market. It's a very non-consolidated market. There are a couple of big industry players and then a lot of small ones, and they can't necessarily cover all the new announcements by the small OEMs. Second is, lots of these bigger manufacturers have certain connections to industry or to other mobility providers. In the case of urban buses, you saw that there were a lot of models available, for instance, from BYD. So just as the case in the US, one model, if it's bought by a big company, like with Amazon and the Rivians, can reach high sales volumes. And I suspect that's lots of the story that's happening in China. Also, just to plug that the IEA is working on a special report dedicated to China. And so we're looking at these kind of questions. Next question is from Francois Gounod. And I would like to suggest that Jacopo takes this question. And he asks, are you also monitoring the announcements made by vehicle OEMs to stop developing or selling internal combustion engine vehicles and the share of production that they represent?
Thanks, Francois, for the question. Yes, we do. We don't take into account this directly into our scenarios. Those are more guided by the government and government policies, like fuel economy standards, targets set by, or targets on electric vehicle deployment set by countries. But yes, we do take into account every year the announcements done by major OEMs, and we are covering this in Chapter 1 of the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook 2021. What we see is that as of the end of 2020, 18 of the major 20 original equipment manufacturers in the world, which overall account for 90% of the total car sales. These 18 largest manufacturers have set some type of targets on electrification, either in terms of cumulative sales of electric cars, either in terms of a certain share of the total sales to be electric in a given year, or in terms of making electric cars models available. And what we also try to do is that we want to compare our projections in electric cars, actually electric light duty vehicles, both for cars and vans. The future deployment of electric light duty vehicles, we compare it with the announcements of the original equipment manufacturers. And what we see from this year is that the stated policy scenario seems to be very well aligned with the OEM's announcements until 2023, while later on, the original equipment manufacturers are better aligned with the sustainable development scenario. Thanks, Francois.
Okay, Francois is full of good questions, so I'll take actually the next one from him. He asks, how is the range of heavy-duty vehicles calculated by CalSTART? As far as I know, there are no standard procedure legislation for range determination of electric trucks and buses in most countries and regions. And indeed, that's correct, Francois, as you know very well. The ranges that we're reporting there are the manufacturer announced range. And you're pointing out an important gap in the regulations, for instance, in the EU. There is no standardized procedure put in place to determine heavy-duty vehicle electric range in a way that's uniform and fair across OEMs. And Francois, I trust that this is a policy shortcoming that you will hope to close, and I'm looking forward to seeing that happen. Next question I'd like to take is on battery recycling. So with the increase in sales for battery electric vehicles, what initiatives are being made to give batteries a second life and recycling phase? And Leonardo, Dr. Pauli, if you could take on this question.
Yes, thank you very much. So one example of work being done to address this issue is what has been happening in the European Union with the revision of the 2006 EU Battery Directive that has been updated to ensure that the value of critical materials is retained as much as possible and to minimize mining. In China too, there's been developments, and in 2010 there was a framework that mandates the extended producer responsibility that makes battery manufacturers responsible for labeling and also mandates the creation of recycling channels and battery collection. Now, another thing that is important to say is that technology is also important, and there are technical solutions that can improve the recycling of batteries. And I would like to point you towards the work that we've been doing last year in Chapter 4 of GWO 2020, where there is a detailed assessment of battery recycling and all of its ramifications.
Thank you, Leo. Next question I'll give to Jacopo. The question is, what were the reasons that electric vehicle sales in Europe did so well? Is it just policies by European governments, something car manufacturers are doing, or changing consumer trends?
Yes, so there is a mix of reasons that can explain this. First of all, we believe that the main reason, especially in Europe, is the pre-existing policy measures and the regulatory framework that was already in place before the pandemic. And most important, the fact that in 2020, original equipment manufacturers in Europe must stick to the EU emission standards, which is basically 95 grams of CO2 emissions per kilometer as a maximum across the average light-duty vehicle fleet, car fleet that is sold. And basically, in order to meet this regulation, OEMs need to sell. They cannot fulfill it just selling internal combustion engines cars, but they also need to sell a certain share of either hybrid vehicles or plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles. And so this is definitely pulling up the sales of these cars. On top of that, what happened is that during the pandemic, as Dr. Connolly mentioned, several European countries increased the incentives for electric cars. Germany is the country that increased incentives the most. It increased it to from $7,000 to battery electric vehicles. The incentives increased from $7,000 to $10,000. But also France, Italy, and Spain increased the incentives. And this was definitely creating was more appealing for customers. And the third reason that we see is the fact that there is a growing availability of electric car models. Dr. Pauli has shown it at the beginning that the growth of electric cars model availability has been the largest in the European market. So the largest in the model availability, the more chances there are for customers that want to purchase an electric car to find the one that they want. And at the same time, also battery prices are reducing, and this leads to the reduction in the price of electric vehicles.
Thanks, Jacopo. Okay, the next question on the docket, I'll give to Chris. The question is, how did the United Kingdom compare to other countries for electric car sales in 2020? And how do its policies for encouraging electric car uptake compare to other countries?
Thanks, Jacob. So in both regards, the UK is broadly similar to other European countries. The UK sold about 175,000 electric vehicles in 2020. 11% of the UK cars sold were electric, and this amounted to 13% of Europe's total electric sales. This was similar to France, which sold 180,000 electric vehicles, although this was less than half of the EV sales in Germany, which were almost 400,000. The 11% sales share number, which I mentioned, is similar to that of other large countries, but less than the forerunners like Norway, Sweden, or the Netherlands. On the policy side of things, the UK has ambitions, firstly, to phase out petrol and diesel passenger light-duty vehicle sales by 2030, and for all sales of passenger light-duty vehicles to be battery electric vehicles or fuel cell electric vehicles by 2035.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Next question from Francisco Leveron. I'll give to Elizabeth. Do you include the China 2060 climate neutrality target in your projections? How could your results change with the new US government policy ambitions that haven't yet been put into legislation?
Great. So our stated policy scenario, the STEPS scenario, focuses on established regulations and things that have already been legislated. So we haven't included the net zero pledge by China in our scenarios because they haven't actually been enacted into legislation. But our sustainable development scenario does look at broader ambitions, but really focuses on some of China's short-term goals. So I mentioned the 20% zero emission vehicle sales by 2025. So that kind of thing is included. Similarly, with the US, we're happy to see these promising signals from the new administration, especially in terms of their proposed infrastructure plan, which is to support electric vehicle supply chains and charging infrastructure. But again, since this is just in the proposal stage and legislation hasn't been enacted, we're not including this in our scenarios. Again, our sustainable development scenario aligns with the Paris Agreement. And so in this way, though, we see that it might be similar to the administration's visions and goals.
Excellent, Elizabeth. So we have time for one final question, and rest assured that some of the very difficult and interesting and provocative questions that we've gotten from some of you, we will follow up one-on-one. This one, I actually don't know how to correctly say the name of the questioner, so I'll skip that. But the question is, could you outline the promises or pitfalls of new battery chemistries? And this I'll give to our battery guru, Dr. Pauli.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. So there are several, when we mention about new battery chemistries, we could be talking about many different things. I would just like to outline some of the key trends. So the first one is the trend that is going towards higher nickel and manganese content and ever decreasing cobalt content. And this trend is now seems to have reached levels where actually 90% of nickel can be used in the battery. And the benefit of this is, first of all, higher energy density and also lower reliance on cobalt, which is one of the metals that has, let's say, the most complicated supply chains. This is one trend. Of course, there are technical difficulties to have this high level of nickel, but there's sort of technical advances are allowing these chemistries to function in a safe way. There's also high manganese batteries that are being mentioned now. Volkswagen has recently discussed about this type of battery that could also be promising and coming into the next few years. And here again, the main benefits are, let's say, a good energy density, a good stability, and removing the reliance on the more complicated parts of the supply chain. When we look a bit further into the future, the next step is solid-state battery. And in that regard, it is difficult to say what will happen because it is a technology that is under rapid development. There are new entrants in terms of startups, and there are new discoveries being made sort of every month nearly. But what is important to know about these batteries is that their main benefits are going to be higher energy density and higher safety because the inflammable electrolyte will no longer be there. One interesting thing about solid-state batteries is that depending on the design, something that could happen is that they could require higher shares of lithium. So actually the amount of lithium required by these batteries might actually be higher than conventional lithium ion. And this is one potential pitfall of this new technology. However, on the other hand, it could also be less depending on the design if the anode-less technology manages to gain a foothold. So all in all, there is a lot of uncertainty on this, but developments are rapid and they are set to transform the EV market yet again in the next few years.
Thanks, Leonardo. And I think we've come to the end of today's webinar. I want to thank everyone for having made it today. And please rest assured that we will answer to the questions that have remained unanswered during this session on a one-to-one. We have your emails and we will write back to you. Please also note that you will be able to find the recording of today's webinar on the IAA website, and we will also make available the slides that we've used for this presentation. I invite everyone to download the Global Electric Vehicle Outlook 2021 from our website. It's freely available. You just need to register on the IAA website for those of you who are not registered yet. And invite everyone also to explore the new tools that we've made available together with the Global EV Outlook this year, the Global Electric Vehicle Policy Explorer and the Global Electric Vehicle Data Explorer. Thank you very much, and thanks particularly to the EVI members for the continuous support that is enabling us to carry out this analysis. Thanks. Have a nice day.